But I think the Turkish example carries some merit. It also has proven itself, at least in the last couple of months, to be able to achieve things that the Europeans and the P5 had not managed to achieve. And if we are serious about this diplomatic process, if we're serious to make sure that not only are we going to be innovative, not only are we going to be creative in making sure that we find new ways of putting pressure on Iran economically, and we've shown ourselves to be quite creative, perhaps some of that creativity also needs to come in when we address how can we make diplomacy successful. And that, I think, does then merit taking a look at other countries that can infuse that trust. Beyond other countries, I think there are other issues that are also important. One, I would agree with Michael, that going forward with diplomacy, particularly after what happened in Iran last year in the elections, with the massive human rights violations that are continuing to this day, without putting human rights on the agenda, is a mistake that will cost the United States quite a lot in the long run as well as in the short run. I'm not arguing that the Obama administration did not seek to do so. The argument was that they were going to have a very open agenda. But nevertheless, the first issue to be discussed was the nuclear issue. And since no agreement was found on that after 2 meetings, there's not been any other diplomacy in which human rights, which is currently deteriorating further in Iran, could be addressed. Furthermore, one of the most effective ways to really be able to find out if trust exists or not is to try to make sure that we are a bit clearer on what is the desired end state that we would like to see come out of a negotiation, and demand the same thing from the Iranians, because I don't think the Iranians have been particularly clear either. Part of the mistrust is precisely because both sides are trying to guess what the other state's end game is and what their intentions are. And as long as you don't have confidence of what the end result can be, that you can live with the desired end state of the other state, then this mistrust is going to make even the best modalities, the best constellations of a diplomatic setup very, very difficult to achieve. On that, I'll stop and look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Trita and Michael, why don't you both stand here at the front. Very interesting analysis, with Trita saying at the end that we need to be more clear about the end result. One of the arguments that Shenna makes, of course, is that maybe we should abandon the zero enrichment or reconsider the zero enrichment policy. And I'd like to hear what you both think about that, if we think that's if that is in fact unrealistic, or if that should be the end goal.
Well, to be clear, if you look at the UN Security Council resolutions, zero enrichment is not put forward as an end goal. It's put forward as that a suspension is required of the Iranians for this negotiations process to kick off, and that's always how it was presented to the Iranians. And the logic behind this, of course, is that and it is, again, this is forgotten quite easily, but it was two-sided. That there's also a pledge in the resolutions that consideration of further sanctions would also be suspended during the period of these negotiations. And this is meant to ensure trust. It's meant to ensure confidence in the negotiations themselves, that one side can't simply use the negotiations to stall and perfect, either in Iran's case, its enrichment capabilities. And frankly, it also serves as a very clear marker of when the negotiations are over if they were to choose to resume enrichment. It's not so unlike the procedures the IAEA has in place. They place seals on things, and when the seals are broken, that's a very clear indication that policy has changed. So I do think the suspension of enrichment makes sense. And I think that the fact that Iran has not considered it, they portray it as an exercise of their rights or whatever it may be, but I think it shows that they're not necessarily that interested in negotiations, as is shown by the fact that they don't show up to meetings. You talk about engagement not working, Trita, but the fact is that it's the Iranians and not the P5+1 that have refused to schedule even a meeting, even a discussion. And I think a side that is interested in trust, the first step is you need to sit down at the table.
I think, let me put it this way. Last year, I think it was Ambassador François Nicolot, who was the French ambassador to Tehran during the first phase of the negotiations, was here in Washington at a conference. And he made a statement that I thought was quite interesting. He mentioned that the original modalities of the negotiations were such that suspension was supposed to continue as long as the negotiations continued. not as long as there was progress in the negotiations, but as long as the negotiations continued. And he said that as soon as the Europeans managed to get Iran to suspend, the negotiations started, the sense of urgency on the European side essentially ended, because the objective of getting them to suspend and stop the enrichment program had already been achieved. The Iranians had a completely different expectation, thinking that this would be something in which they would move rather quickly towards a solution. What was very interesting was that in essence, he summed it up saying that during that period in which there was a suspension and it was only tied to the continuation of the negotiations, it was actually the European side that didn't see that it was that valuable to move quickly. Now, that has fueled the suspicion that any suspension requirement, even if it is not tied explicitly to a zero enrichment objective, nevertheless is a slippery slope towards that, and that is the ultimate objective of the West. Now, whether that is right or wrong, I think is a different issue. The issue that at this point, to me, is more important. If we are increasingly coming to the conclusion, and one of the points in this article was that zero enrichment is not achievable. That is not an isolated view. That view exists in the US government as long as in many, many European governments. The question is, what is the value to then still not be clear about that? Well, one of the values has been to say that that's a negotiation card. If the negotiations begin, if they're successful, we won't open up by giving up this very, very valuable card, but at the end of it, if talks are successful, we can consider giving it up. But that's not been explicit in the sense of declaring that willingness. I'm not so sure if that works. I'm not so sure that that will give the amount of confidence that is needed in order to, as Michael said, get the talks started. We need to have measures that not only get the talks started, but make sure that the talks actually get sustained, that we have the political will on all sides, and I'm very, very concerned about the Iranian side on this. There are plenty of elements, as Michael pointed out, that do not necessarily want to see negotiations succeed. They have been very effective in Iran in making sure that Iran gets paralyzed at very, very important moments. Not the same situation, but similar situation exists here as well. To succeed in diplomacy, you have to have enough political capital, enough political will to overcome the last hurdle on the road towards a diplomatic solution. At the first hurdle of the road in October, this process collapsed already. That is an indication of insufficient political will on all sides.